Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Principal Liner Notes podcast. This is Sean Gaylord, and this is it. This is the final episode of a podcast that has been a passion project of mine for the last 8 seasons, and it has come to conclusion. And it if you're hearing hesitancy, or if you're watching this and you're seeing hesitancy, I'm definitely not hesitant about ending the podcast, and I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But I'm a little speechless right now, which is rare for me, for somebody who does like to kind of ramble and meander and play with words and play with language and ad lib. And I'm a little emotional. In fact, I have waited the better part of the end of the day to record this podcast episode, this particular one, as I have been putting it off all day, because I knew, in the reflective and retrospective mood that I've been in as I've looked back on the origins of this podcast and our time together, I'm a little emotional. So hopefully I will make sense in the next few minutes, and I will be able to bring things to some level of closure and resolution, and then we'll end it here. But it is by no means over. I'm not going anywhere. I don't intend to, and I just want to press pause on this particular project. And I blogged about this earlier today, and you can check that out in my blog post, so long to the Principal Liner Notes podcast. And all roads for me intersect with music, and as you know, it has been a lifelong passion of mine. And outside of my faith and my family, music runs pretty close in terms of priorities and passions. And I always think in terms of a soundtrack. I always think in terms of what song would fit in this moment, or if I was creating a movie in my mind, which I often do, what piece of music would serve to enhance the mood of the scene, or what piece of music would advance the plot. And as I was reflecting today on the end of the Principal Liner Notes podcast, I thought about a practice that I used to do back in my high school English teacher days. I used to, for the summer, out of the many summer gigs that I would do, I taught at Governor School West in North Carolina, where I live, located on the beautiful campus of Salem College in the heart of Winston-Salem, right across the street, really right down the street from Old Salem. And that was teacher heaven in a lot of ways. We were um, teaching for the sake of really promoting inquiry with students who were looking for ways to be challenged and motivated in a very innovative, creative, educational environment. And it was a very intense summer experience, and he developed a bond with the class and with colleagues, and I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I felt seen. I felt stretched. I felt at home because I was with kindred spirits who were teaching for the sake of teaching. We were learning for the sake of learning. There weren't lesson plans or grades or deadlines or anything like that. And the last day of class, I would play "So Long, Frank Lloyd Wright" by Simon and Garfunkel. It's a track off of their final album together, their masterpiece album, Bridge Over Troubled Water. Of course, most of you know the title track of the song, but if you explore that album, in many ways, it's Simon and Garfunkel I think realizing it's the end of their musical partnership, and they're trying to express that throughout the album in different ways. And the song "So Long, Frank Lloyd Wright" is in many ways it's Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel saying goodbye to each other in a song. And I knew that the governor's school, which was a very intense educational experience in a good way, bonding and camaraderie, and we really built a learning community. And it was hard for kids to leave that, and it was hard for me to leave that. So I used that song as a way to put a salve on the situation, as a way to ameliorate the high emotion that kids were experiencing and I was experiencing, because we had to go back to our regular daily gigs and our regular lives. And I thought about that song today as I'm wrapping up the Principal Liner Notes podcast, and it got me reflecting on the origins of what started, about 8 seasons ago. And as I talked about in my blog post, and I share with you now, and I've shared many things with you, dear listener, over the last eight seasons. And one of the things that, if you remember, is that leadership is lonely. It really is. They don't teach you that in principal school. There isn't a class on it, and as principal, you learn very quickly that relationships do matter, and that connections matter, because you're the only principal in the building, or you may be the only one like you in the building or district or department. And so I dealt with, um, man, just early on in my principalship, a lot of loneliness and making hard decisions, and trying to find my voice, and trying to find my leadership um, groove, if you will. And I would battle just days and hours and weeks of loneliness, and it was tough. And I was losing friendships, I was losing connections with folks. And around that time, I was just discovering my PLN and professional learning network, and finding that there were kindred spirits out there who not only thought like me in some cases, but also stretched my thinking, and exposed me to new ideas and new thoughts, and then also encouraged me to be creative and to share content. So the podcast was really my antidote to leadership loneliness. It was my attempt to find connection with others, to be creative, because every principal, every leader, you need a trap door. You need to find that outlet. You need to find something that you can hold on to, that you can keep in in the grind of leadership. That's yours. That's you. And you have to do that on a whole lot of different levels. And the podcast was about that. And in some cases, you may have heard me struggling with loneliness and imposter syndrome, and trying to, but ultimately trying to make a connection. And listener and friend, we developed a connection over the years, you and me, right? You and me, we developed a bond in which I was speaking from my heart to yours. I was speaking from where I was, and I was looking for somebody to share that with. And for the times that you pressed play or download and took me on your walk, or took me on your jog, or added me to your workout, or part of your commute, I'm very grateful for you, for listening to me and seeing me just as I see you, and just as I want to listen with you, because this podcast was all about connection. And I would imagine that, and I would keep that in mind as I was recording and preparing this podcast, that I was thinking of that other lonely leader out there, that other lonely person out there, that was looking for someone just to listen, for looking for someone to just have a connection or to bond with or to step out of the grind and the deadlines and the paperwork and the microaggressions and all of the things that we as leaders have to deal with. And I'm very grateful for that relationship that we had, and that you indulged me in attempting to make sense out of leadership through the lens of music, and to express that, and to kind of deal with my ramblings and connections, whether it was the Beatles, of course, my favorite band, or making a connection to John Coltrane or Miles Davis or Tina Turner or CCR or the Allman Brothers or the Doors, or and the list goes on, because I find a lot of meaning in music, not just from an aesthetic standpoint, but I find that there were a lot of lessons and ideas and insights to share along the way. And as I worked up the courage to expand the podcast, to invite guests, you were there as well. And I'm very grateful for all of the guests. And I don't want to name any of the guests because I feel like I'm going to miss somebody. And I'm kind of improvising and ad-libbing this podcast as we speak. And I don't have a list in front of me. But for those of you who were a guest on this podcast, I'm very grateful for you for taking the time to improvise and ad lib. As you know, this is very much a homemade podcast by design. I don't have a studio. I don't have a lot of equipment. It was really, when I was doing the podcast, it was either through the Anchor app on my iPhone or through the magic of Zoom and using the Spotify for Podcasters platform. And so I'm very grateful, guests, because I was reaching out to you personally, looking for connection, looking to develop our friendship, looking to start a friendship. And in many ways, many of the folks who have been guests on the podcast, we have either deepened our friendship or we've started a friendship. And now we have this thing where I might get a text from you or a nice note from you, or um, if one of us is having a bad day, we can reach out to each other. So I'm very grateful for the other leaders and mentors and educators and folks who took the time, mostly on a Saturday, because I'm very um, I'm very strict about not colliding this outside project with regular school hours, and not colliding this project with family time. So I'm very grateful for those of you who got up early with me on Saturday morning, or late on a Friday evening, and recorded an episode and recorded our conversation. And I always envisioned the those connected conversation episodes as myself and the guest either wandering around a record store or sitting at a coffee shop, and we were talking about ideas and we were talking about things, and then we saw you, listener, and we invited you in to our conversation. We invited you in to sit with us, and to take some time to pause and learn with us, and grow with us. And so I'm very, very grateful for all of the guests. You've invested time. You believed in this homemade podcast. You believed in the power of one take. I don't do any editing. I've only had to edit the podcast once, by the way. Somebody dropped an F-bomb, and this is kind of a PG rated podcast. But other than that, everything that you're hearing, everything that you saw, everything that you experienced on the podcast was done very much in the moment without any multiple takes. Those of you, may remember an episode where either my wife or one of my daughters would peek in and say hello, or hey, I'm going out for an errand, or what have you, and I appreciate you in indulging in those interruptions. The other thing about the Principal Liner Notes podcast is this: it like I said, every principal needs a trapdoor, needs a hobby. You need a passion project. You need something that's going to fuel you and inspire you. And sometimes I would walk into an episode feeling some level of being a downer or upset about something, and so you help me work through some things, and I would always end the podcast refreshed and energized and ready to face whatever opportunity or whatever challenge that was going to become an opportunity that lay ahead. And so I'm very grateful for that. I do feel that the time is right to press pause on this podcast because frankly, I'm interested in exploring new territory and not being stuck in a rut and not being stuck in any kind of hamster wheel of creativity. As some of you may know, and I've hinted at this and I've talked about this over the last 9 months or so, I had a very serious health scare that propelled me to a hospital and had a what would I guess would be called a heart episode, and it was a wake up call in a lot of ways to kind of recalibrate my fitness, my stress levels, my blood pressure, and but also it compelled me to take really a deeper look at my life and where I was with things, specifically with the people that I love, because at one point I thought I was going to lose them, and I'm very grateful that I'm on the other side of that health scare and taking better care and feeling even more fit and fulfilled and purposeful. To embrace life and to embrace each of the small moments that I have with others, I consider those small moments gifts and moments of grace and love. So with that, I have decided to kind of press pause on the Principal Liner Notes podcast to explore new territories and to explore new levels of creativity. I talk about innovation. Heck, I wrote a book about innovation, the Pepper Effect, and wrote about how the Beatles, when they retired from live performance, decided to explore new territories, and they actually took a break from each other, and each of the four members of the band went kind of in different directions, whether it was to reconnect with family, explore and travel around the world and do things that they typically didn't do, or to take some time to focus on the things that they may not have had time to do during the Beatlemania touring years. And so that's kind of the same mindset with pressing pause on the Principal Liner Notes podcast. And so I have a few new projects that I'm working on. One, you may have heard me talk about Megan Lawson, who has been a frequent guest on this podcast. She and I are collaborating on a podcast miniseries exploring this idea of hope, the art and science of hope. And in fact, that podcast will be debuting this Saturday, November the 2nd. And follow the hashtag hope amplified, and be sure to tune in and to subscribe to that mini podcast series or podcast mini series. And we've got a few special guests on board for that, one of them being Lauren Kaufman, who is the unofficial executive producer of the podcast. And I do have to thank her for all of her support and encouragement with the Principal Liner Notes podcast. She was kind of my frequent flyer when it came to sharing ideas or questions or bantering about, and I do need to give her a very special shout out. So Hope Amplified with Megan Lawson, that is coming up on November the 2nd, and we've got about 5 or 6 episodes prepared, and those will drop in the month of November all the way up until I believe the end of or middle or end of December. So we've got that coming up. The second project that I have coming up, which I'm really excited about, is a new podcast which is not going to focus on education, is not going to focus on leadership, but really this intersection again with music and stories. One of the things that I've realized about this podcast is, and that I've learned about myself is that I love to tell a good story, and sometimes those stories can ramble and go very long, and in other cases, they can be short and succinct. But either way, I'm very much interested in how music and stories connect. And so I've got a 12 episode series coming up in January 2025 called Chords of Connection. And that is where I will explore this intersection with music and stories and really explore the storytelling aspect and the songs and albums that I love and hopefully you love too. There may be a guest along the way. I'm not sure about that yet. But I am exploring that idea of having a couple of guests on here and there. But it will focus on music and stories, and I'm excited about that. The other thing, kind of another project, and again, my time is precious, but another kind of passion project that I could not say no to was the opportunity to teach a college level course on the Beatles next semester called Why the Beatles. And I am very excited. High Point University reached out and I gladly and honorably and humbly accepted the offer to teach a course on a band that I love and adore. And I know probably on my social media channels I will share that experience. I'm sure I'm going to blog about it. And who knows, there may be another book that comes out of it. I do have another book in me. I know that I've hinted at that over the last several years, and frankly, between writer's block and confidence in my writing and other levels of politics, I haven't gotten around to writing a second book. And so I'm really committed to doing this for 2025. And so I've kind of got these two short podcast projects and the course, and then I really want to get back into some serious writing. You've noticed that probably if you followed the Principal Liner Notes blog that I keep, and I've been sharing more writing and kind of challenging and pushing myself to write every week. As my good friends and frequent guests on this podcast, Lauren Kaufman and Megan Lawson, have done so beautifully and eloquently, and a whole lot better than I could even possibly strive for in their beautiful podcast or their beautiful blogs. Please be sure to follow them and get the same level of wisdom and inspiration that I've gotten. I've mentioned the Beatles many times on this podcast, and there are many reasons why I love this band and many reasons why I will continue to love this band. But it all comes down to really one thing, which is the reason why this podcast started in the first place. Mention the word connection. As someone who's been on this planet for 54 years, who has dealt with the slings and arrows of racism, being somebody who is proudly light skinned as an African American, and being how I look and being who I am, it can sometimes be difficult to find connection. Growing up, I was never black enough for a certain crowd or for certain people, or I was never white enough for certain people, and I struggled with trying to find a group of friends and people that would accept me for who I was. And I remember finding connection in the Beatles, not just musically, not just because they were a great band, but because on their final kind of round together, when they were recording the Get Back, Let It Be album, they invited a fifth member into the band, Billy Preston. Billy Preston being a African American keyboardist of great talent and soul and humility fit seamlessly into the band, and ended up playing with the Beatles in what was their final live performance, the Rooftop, which I've talked about. And if you check out the Let It Be film or the Get Back documentary, you can see Billy Preston in all of his glory with the Beatles. And I, as a kid, was very inspired by that because I felt if the Beatles, four white guys, four Englishmen from Liverpool, were going to accept a black person like Billy Preston, then maybe they'd have room in the band for me. Maybe they would accept me and wouldn't judge me because of the pigmentation of my skin. Again, connection. So I felt that, and I still feel that connection, and that connection is so important that we as leaders foster and steward and nurture. That it really comes down to connection and bringing people in and building your band, as I like to talk about, and that everybody in the band has a role, has a part, and helps make that sound fly and soar because we're all working together, sharing our strengths, sharing our gifts, and acknowledging that great human band that we are all in and that connects us. And so as I wrap up the Principal Liner Notes podcast, one more thing I want to mention. People have asked, what is your favorite episode, or do you have a favorite guest? And I do. And I'm going to mention that guest right here, right now, somebody who I love deeply, and somebody whom I've loved for all of her life, and that's my daughter Emily Gaylord. And this may have been about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that she was a guest on the Principal Liner Notes podcast, and I had such great parental pride. I'm a proud Niner dad. I'm proud of all of my daughters, and I'm very grateful that Emily and I we were able to be on the podcast together. Um, and it was something she had to do for an assignment, and it kind of worked out beautifully that I had the podcast, and it fit blended in with the requirements of the assignment. So I'm very grateful for that moment. But as I think about my three daughters, and I think about that, not only was this podcast my attempt to connect with myself, to connect with my wonderful guests, and to connect with you, dear listener, but it was also my way. As I look back and I look back at some of the episodes, not only was I talking to you or the guest or me, I was talking to my daughters, and perhaps subconsciously, and sharing lessons and ideas and a legacy for them as they continue to grow. All of them are young women now, and many of you grew up with them on this podcast. If you heard a reference, or you may have seen or heard them in the background. And so this podcast is also a legacy that my daughters will have. And when I'm gone, which is going to be for a long, long, long time from now, but that they can go back and share this with their kids, and hear a little bit about the kind of the small impact that I was able to make in this podcast. So I'm very grateful for that. So getting ready to sign off. And as I always sign off, it's a sentence that comes from my heart to yours. And I'm going to say it one more time. It's not over. It's just kind of a pause for now. Don't forget, don't forget, don't forget to share with the world your dreams, your thoughts, your ideas, because the world needs them, and you help make the world a better place for others. This is Sean Gaylord. This is the final episode of the Principal Liner Notes podcast. Signing off for now. I'm going to catch you on the flip side. Hope to see you on the Hope Amplified podcast and the upcoming Chords of Connection podcast. And the journey continues, and I'm grateful being on the journey with you. So as I slowly fade to black, I'll catch you on the flip side because there's always a flip side, and I'll see you there.